The courtroom was thick with tension as Lord Blackwood stood, his mask of confidence slipping, revealing a man on the edge of his unraveling. The truth, hidden beneath layers of deceit for years, was about to break free, and with it, the fate of an innocent man hung in the balance. In that moment it wasn't just justice that would be served, it was redemption or ruin for those brave enough to face the truth. But not everyone was ready to hear it, and in the shadows, a quiet observer, Agatha Marple, knew one thing for certain: the story was far from over. It was only just beginning. A damp chill had wrapped itself tightly around the sprawling city of London, the evening air heavy with an ancient unease, as if the very breath of the city was holding secrets too dark to utter. The streets were shrouded in a thick, swirling fog, its icy fingers caressing the gaslit lanterns that struggled to cast any light at all. Shadows danced and flickered, teasing the eye as the mist seemed to shift in patterns of its own design, an ethereal veil over a city forever haunted by its past. In the distance, the constant murmur of the city's heartbeat, its restless, ceaseless hum, breathed through the streets, carrying with it echoes of ambition, sin, and moments of fleeting redemption. At the heart of this ominous urban labyrinth stood the Old Bailey, its imposing stone facade a silent testament to the weight of justice. Yet tonight, the facade felt more like a mask, its stern presence cloaking the truth in shadows. The justice it promised seemed as intangible as the mist that clung to the city, elusive and shrouded in ambiguity. Inside, the courtroom was a vast cavernous space, the shadows stretching long across the dark wood paneling and gleaming marble floors. Every corner, every inch of space seemed to be soaked in an oppressive tension, a palpable sense of waiting, as though the room itself was holding its breath, anticipating the unraveling of something monumental. The gallery, a restless sea of onlookers, whispered in low, anxious tones. Their gazes flickered between the witness stand and each other, their collective nervousness rising with each passing moment, as if the fate of all who stood in that room hinged on the testimony of one man. And at the very center of this storm of whispered speculations and stifled breaths, stood Arthur Beck, his presence as fragile as a dying ember in a windstorm. His gaunt face was pale, his features sharp with the lines of a man who had weathered more than a lifetime's worth of storms. His eyes, distant and clouded with memories better left untouched, betrayed a deep inner turmoil. As he moved slowly toward the witness stand, each step seemed to reverberate through the courtroom, the echo of his footsteps merging with the strained silence, a slow march into a realm where truth and lies blurred. The tremor in his hands, the way he clutched the edge of the podium, was a stark indication of the battle raging inside him, a war between duty and the overwhelming weight of the secrets he held. His eyes, heavy with the burden of years of unspoken regrets, flickered briefly with a glimmer of something that bordered on truth, but he was terrified to let it fully emerge. And amid this sea of anxiety and uncertainty, there sat a figure who observed everything with unnerving stillness. In the far corner of the gallery, Detective Agatha Marple sat like a shadow among shadows. To anyone else, she was just another face in the crowd, but her eyes were sharp as daggers, cutting through the layers of pretense that enveloped the room. Her presence was as quiet as a whisper, yet her mind was working at a pace that no one could fathom, piecing together fragments of evidence, body language and spoken words into an intricate web of knowledge. She watched Beck, not just with the eyes of a detective, but with the unrelenting focus of someone who knew that beneath every lie, there was always a truth waiting to be uncovered. As Beck's steps brought him ever closer to the witness stand, Agatha's thoughts churned, sifting through the details of the case, like a patient spider weaving its web, knowing that every movement, every word, could be the key to unlocking the mystery that lay hidden beneath the surface. Outside, the fog continued to swirl, wrapping the streets of London in its impenetrable embrace. It felt as though the very city itself was conspiring to hide something dark, something that would change everything. Inside, the tension in the courtroom grew more suffocating with every passing second. The fog outside, pressed against the windows like a living, breathing entity, its soft whispers echoing the uncertainty of those within. The gaslights flickered, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to dance in time with the heartbeats of those who watched, as the room seemed to hold its collective breath. And then, with the weight of the room bearing down on him, Arthur Beck's voice cut through the silence. It was fragile at first, tentative, as though his words were struggling to take form. "I remember, a figure, a man." His voice trailed off as his eyes darted around the room, his gaze flitting from one person to the next, as though searching for something to ground him in his own fractured memory. "A railway worker, I think, Henry Fletcher, and then, a man, well-dressed, disappearing." His words hung in the air, fragmented and broken, just like the memory he was trying to recall. The courtroom was still, the silence so deep that the faintest rustle of clothing or scratch of a pen seemed magnified. Murmurs swept through the gallery, reporters scribbling furiously, their pens flying across the pages as the jury leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Beck, trying to make sense of what little he had given them. His testimony was like a thread pulled loose, but it was not yet clear where it would lead. The judge, his voice calm yet edged with authority, interrupted the murmur. "Mr. Beck," he said, his gaze unwavering, "can you provide more details about this man? A description?" Beck's hands trembled as he gripped the podium, his knuckles white. "He wore a fine suit," he stammered, his voice still shaky, "dark, elegant, not the kind of man you'd expect in these parts." His words faltered as his mind seemed to flounder, struggling to hold on to the fleeting image. His face, just a shadow, a blur, disappearing. His words faded, lost in the vast silence of the courtroom, as the memory seemed to slip further and further from his grasp, receding like an ocean tide that could not be stopped. Agatha Marple's eyes never left him. She studied every twitch of his lips, every shift in his posture, her mind working furiously to decode the subtle language of his body. She could see the cracks in his performance, the unease that laced his every word, tension that betrayed his attempt to hide something deeper. She knew that Beck was not simply an innocent man with a fragmented memory. He was hiding something he feared would tear him apart if it ever came to light. As the fog pressed against the windows and the tension in the room mounted, it became clear, this was no ordinary case. Every word, every detail, every hesitation would add another layer to a story where nothing could be trusted. The truth was hidden beneath layers of deceit, and it was up to Agatha Marple to peel them back, one by one, until it was finally revealed. The courtroom seemed to constrict with every passing second, the weight of its silence pressing down upon all who occupied it, and the fog outside, as if in cruel sympathy, thickened, swallowing the city whole. Arthur Beck's testimony, already a fractured collection of elusive details, began to reveal not merely the blurry contours of a memory, but something far more unsettling, a deliberate attempt to obscure the truth. Each word he spoke trembled like a broken thread, hesitant, as if he feared the very act of revealing what he knew. The jury, eyes wide with confusion, exchanged glances, whispering with growing concern and doubt. One voice broke the murmur. "Henry Fletcher, a railway worker, you say? Hardly the sort to be mixed up in something like this." It was a remark dripping with both sympathy and skepticism, a verdict formed before any evidence could reach the light. But another voice, quieter and far more curious, added, "And what of the other man? The one in the fine suit, who is he?" The very question seemed to twist the mystery further, like an unseen hand pulling the threads tighter, making the shadows deepen. Beck's voice cracked through the murmur. I saw them together. For only a moment," he continued, his words faltering. "Fletcher seemed burdened, lost, almost. And the other, his face hidden in shadow, but his presence spoke volumes. His eyes shifted, dark and full of fear, as though the truth itself were an enemy too powerful to confront. The contrast between the two men, the humble railway worker and the well-dressed, elusive figure, spoke volumes, but to what end? Was it a story of coincidence or something far darker? The prosecutor's sharp voice cut through the air like a blade, demanding clarity. "Mr. Beck, are you suggesting these men were working together, or have you merely misremembered?" The room held its breath. Beck's response was as fragile as a whispered confession, his gaze hollow, lost in the depths of a fog he could no longer navigate. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible, swallowed by the weight of his own uncertainty. His words hung in the air, incomprehensible yet full of implication. "It's as though I'm trying to see through fog, endless fog." Agatha Marple, sitting quietly in the back corner, could not help but let a slight, knowing smile tug at the corner of her lips. She saw through Beck's trembling facade, a facade constructed from fear, guilt, and half-truths. To her, the fog of his memory was no more than a veil, one she would soon pull away. Her mind, sharp and calculating, processed the fragments of his testimony, reading between the lines as the others failed to see the truth buried beneath. Memory, like the London fog itself, often concealed as much as it revealed. The press, too, sat on the edge of their seats, their pens dancing furiously across paper, aware that Beck's testimony had shifted from a definitive account to a tantalizing riddle. The pieces were in place, but the puzzle was far from complete. The despair in Fletcher's eyes, the impossibly refined gentleman slipping in and out of the shadows, these were the clues that beckoned, but also confounded. Each moment, each uttered fragment of memory, raised more questions than it answered. Yet, the atmosphere was alive with the promise of something sinister, something hidden, waiting for someone to uncover it. As Beck's voice faltered once more, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence, one that seemed to stretch on forever. Every soul within that room knew that the game had changed. The stakes had risen. The interplay of identities, motives, and secrets was no longer a matter of simple facts, but of something far more complex: human ambition, guilt, fear, and the hidden forces pulling the strings. Agatha's mind, ever sharp, raced ahead, piecing the puzzle together, knowing that beyond the outward respectability of London's elite, there were dark, tangled webs of deception, greed and power waiting to be uncovered. The courtroom, once a place of strict order, now seemed on the verge of chaos, as whispered judgments and quiet accusations began to swirl around the gallery. The very walls of the Old Bailey, with their solemn wood paneling and lofty ceilings, could not contain the brewing storm. The questions were mounting. Could Fletcher, the quiet railway worker, really be the key, or was he just another pawn in a far more intricate game? The jury's whispers, now a distant chorus of accusations, painted him as a scapegoat, a simple man who had become the target of a much larger conspiracy. The more they whispered, the more they wove a web of guilt around him, a web that would be nearly impossible to escape. Beck's fractured account, fragile and disjointed as it was, had opened a door into a labyrinth of lies, and now, the room could only wait in taut anticipation, knowing that the truth, once uncovered, would shatter everything. The courtroom, cloaked in a heavy silence, seemed to contract with the rising tension, the very air thick with unseen judgments that hovered like the mist gathering outside. The pristine marble floors, the intricate wood paneling, the high, arched ceilings, all seemed to close in, amplifying the weight of the whispers, the subtle movements, and the unfurling drama within. At the back of the gallery, Henry Fletcher sat alone, his figure a stark contrast to the carefully manicured surroundings. His modest appearance, a worn suit, simple features, did little to inspire confidence, and in that very simplicity, he became the focus of an ever-growing storm of scorn. It was as though his very ordinariness had marked him as an easy target. His presence was an open invitation for criticism, and across the room, a well-dressed gentleman, his tone dripping with disdain, turned to his companion. His voice, cold and clipped, cut through the hum of the courtroom. "It's almost too convenient, don't you think? A man of such humble origins caught in a web of intrigue that demands a more refined mind. What could he possibly know of these matters?" His companion, a slight figure whose eyes darted about nervously, as though the very atmosphere might turn against him, whispered back, "Indeed, his background only serves to reinforce the belief that he is nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. His lack of sophistication disqualifies him from any serious involvement. He is nothing more than a pawn, easily dismissed. The words, laced with contempt, floated over the murmurs of the crowd, their implications clear. The common man, a mere figment of circumstance, could never be trusted with the intricacies of higher matters. The public, eager to latch on to these assumptions, nodded in silent agreement. In the midst of this social whirlwind, Agatha Marple, seated in a dark corner, took it all in with quiet precision. Her spectacles, perched delicately on her nose, caught the light as her eyes moved deftly over the unfolding scene. Every shift in Beck's posture, every hesitation in his voice, every fleeting glance he cast to the side, these were all clues. Beck's testimony, though laden with uncertainty, carried a deeper truth. His fractured recollections spoke not just of confusion, but of internal conflict, a battle between what he remembered and what he feared to remember. The words trembled on his lips, and Agatha noted every subtle detail, each one whispering to her that Beck's struggle was not just with his own mind, but with the pressures bearing down on him from all sides. The prosecutor's sharp voice cut through her thoughts, breaking the fragile silence that had descended upon the room. "Mr. Beck, are you suggesting that these two men were involved together, or are you simply mistaken?" The question hung in the air, sharp and probing, demanding clarity where none could be found. Beck's response was a mere shake of the head, his lips whispering a confession so fragile it barely registered in the air. "I don't know," he murmured, his voice quivering with the weight of his uncertainty. "My mind, it's as though I'm looking through a fog." The final words, barely audible, seemed to evaporate into the charged stillness of the room. Agatha allowed herself a small knowing smile. Her mind, ever sharp, saw the parallels between the fog outside and the fog clouding Beck's mind. Both hid the truth, shrouding it in uncertainty, waiting for the right observer to pierce through the veil. As she observed Beck's trembling form, Agatha knew that beneath the surface of his fractured memory lay something far more complex, a network of motives and fears too tangled to be dismissed so easily. The courtroom, meanwhile, shifted with the whispering tide of bias and prejudice. The murmurs of guilt and suspicion spread like wildfire through the gallery, infecting the very air with a sense of foregone conclusion. The jury, the press, the bystanders, each one had already cast their judgment, and all eyes were now fixed on Henry Fletcher. He, the unassuming railway worker, had become the embodiment of guilt in their minds. Agatha, however, knew better. She knew that truth was rarely as simple as it seemed, and the true nature of the crime lay hidden beneath layers of assumptions and societal biases. The case had become a symbol of a deeper, more insidious truth, one that had been shaped not by the facts but by the prejudices of those in power. She could see it now, the subtle dance of class, the way the courtroom itself, so polished and adorned, had become a breeding ground for judgment, a place where truth was often the first casualty. The very structures that were meant to serve justice had instead become vessels for personal and societal biases. The whispers of the gallery, the cold assumptions made by the wealthy and the powerful, were all part of the web of deception Agatha was determined to untangle. She had seen it before, how easily the public could be led astray by the flimsy threads of prejudice and class division, and she knew that beneath the surface of Henry Fletcher's supposed guilt lay a far more intricate story, one woven from threads of greed, jealousy, and the hidden fears of those who sought to maintain control. As the proceedings continued, Agatha's mind moved with methodical precision. She catalogued every detail, every glance, every moment that seemed insignificant but would later prove vital. She understood the game being played, and she knew that, like a detective tracing a shadow, she would need to look beyond the obvious to uncover the truth. It wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about unraveling the very fabric of deception that held this case together. The stage was set for a revelation, but it would not come easily. It would require patience, insight, and the quiet determination to follow the path that others were too blind to see. And as the gavel fell, and the proceedings continued, Agatha Marple sat quietly, her mind already several steps ahead, ready to expose the truth that others were too eager to overlook. In the soft glow of her dimly lit study, Agatha Marple sat in quiet contemplation, her pen moving across the pages with an almost rhythmic precision, its scratchings in perfect harmony with the soft ticking of an old carriage clock on the mantel. The only other sound was the distant murmur of London's nighttime hum, faintly carried through the half-open window, as though the city itself whispered its secrets to her. Before her lay not just the cold, detached words of testimony, but the intricate puzzle she was determined to unravel. Carefully, Agatha's gaze flicked to the annotated map of London, its corners curling slightly under the weight of time. Streets, alleyways, and hidden landmarks were marked with precise notations, each a thread leading her closer to the elusive truth. The lamp above flickered once, casting a soft light over the neatly organized chaos of her desk, scattered papers, a magnifying glass, and the faint outlines of her next steps. Agatha knew this well. Here in the solitude of her study, she was in her element. Each piece of information, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, found its place in the intricate tapestry she was weaving. The fragments of Arthur Beck's testimony, the whispers of guilt surrounding Henry Fletcher, all these rumors, assumptions, and fleeting details were carefully filed away, waiting to be woven into something more. The air around her seemed to thicken as she worked, each clue solidifying in her mind, like the layers of a mystery slowly taking shape, her thoughts moving like a steady current beneath the surface of her calm exterior. The night outside deepened, but Agatha, undisturbed by time, sifted through the layers of the case with methodical care. She did not rush, there was no need. The quiet of the night was her ally, the stillness of the world outside her window, a perfect counterpoint to the steady flow of her thoughts. Tomorrow, the truth would rise, but for now, she trusted that each moment spent in contemplation brought her closer to the revelation she sought. As the city's hum softened and the stars blinked lazily above, Agatha's mind was already miles ahead, piecing together the story that had yet to be told. The next morning, as the mist still clung to the streets and the London fog began to settle like a blanket over the city, Agatha arrived at Henry Fletcher's modest home. The small terrace house, nestled on a narrow street, stood in stark contrast to the grandiose structures of London's upper classes. Its brickwork, dampened by the evening mist, seemed to shudder under the weight of the secrets it held within. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a quiet anxiety, an undercurrent of fear, that only deepened as Agatha stepped across the threshold. Mrs. Fletcher, a slender woman whose face bore the traces of years spent in quiet worry, greeted Agatha at the door. Her eyes, wide with the uncertainty that had gripped their household, ushered Agatha into the small parlor where Henry's family had been left in limbo, caught between what they knew and what they feared. The room itself was humble, with faded curtains framing a small window and worn furniture scattered about, telling tales of long use and simple comfort. The soft ticking of a clock on the mantel seemed to fill the room, its rhythm marking time in a way that felt almost oppressive, as if the very seconds were counting down to an unknown inevitable truth. Mrs. Fletcher, smoothing the front of her apron, sat beside Agatha, her voice trembling as she spoke of her husband. "He's a good man, always has been," she said, the words heavy with a mixture of love and desperation. "Never in trouble, not once. He's worked on the railway for nearly 20 years. Everyone at the depot knows him. Honest, dependable, never complained, no matter how hard things got." Agatha, her expression calm and gentle, listened intently, her gaze steady. "Tell me more about him," she prompted, her voice soft but insistent. Mrs. Fletcher glanced toward the mantel, where a faded portrait of the family rested. In it, Henry stood tall and proud, his arm draped around his young wife and child. "He's always been a family man," Mrs. Fletcher continued, her voice steadying as she spoke of the man she loved. "Every Sunday, he'd make sure we had dinner together, and if the children needed something, shoes, coats, he'd pick up extra shifts. no hesitation. He never complained, not once. A small voice interrupted them, the sound almost reverent. Henry's young son, about 10 years old, sat nearby, his eyes wide and serious. "Dad's teaching me how to fix things," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Clocks, locks, little engines. He said there's a right way and a wrong way to do things, and we've got to do things right." Agatha's lips curled into a small smile, her mind already turning over the boy's words. She turned her attention to the small details that others might overlook: boots by the door, worn yet carefully maintained, their scuffed leather telling its own quiet story. And on the night in question, Agatha asked, her voice gentle but insistent, was there anything unusual, any visitors, any change in Henry's behavior? Mrs. Fletcher shook her head slowly. "No, nothing. He came home on time, had his tea, played with the children, and then said he was going for a walk before bed. When he didn't come back, well, I thought maybe he'd gotten caught up talking to someone. That happens sometimes. But then, they came to the door, saying he'd been found." Her voice trailed off, and Agatha could see the tremor in her hands, the way the very foundation of her world seemed to be crumbling with each passing second. Agatha, however, remained calm. She had heard enough. The pieces were starting to fall into place. This was no simple case, no simple man. As the shadows of the room deepened, so too did the mystery that surrounded Henry Fletcher, and Agatha Marple was certain of one thing: the truth, no matter how well hidden, would reveal itself in time. At the threshold of Henry Fletcher's home, a place heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, Mrs. Fletcher's voice faltered as she spoke of that terrible night. Her hands, trembling with emotion, reached up to dab at her eyes with the hem of her apron. Agatha, ever patient, let the silence stretch between them before she spoke again, her voice calm but probing. "Did he mention anything unusual at work? Any disputes? Any signs of trouble?" Mrs. Fletcher's brow furrowed, her mind sifting through the memories, seeking something hidden in the recesses of ordinary life. "Now that you mention it," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "he did speak of a new man at the depot, someone he didn't trust, but he never went into detail about it. I didn't push him." Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind already beginning to connect the dots. "A new man, you say?" she repeated, her voice tinged with a curiosity that was hard to mask. "Do you know his name?" Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. "No, I'm afraid not. Henry never spoke much about his work troubles. He kept that part of his life separate, for the children's sake." Agatha's gaze drifted to a small table near the window, where a tin of tobacco sat beside a pocket knife with its blade carefully folded in, a handkerchief embroidered with a single letter neatly placed beside it. The room, though humble, seemed to hum with a quiet dignity, everything in its place, a life lived simply and steadily, until the outside world had intruded. "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher," Agatha said, her voice gentle yet firm. "Your help has been invaluable in understanding the man behind the accusations." As she rose to her feet, Mrs. Fletcher grasped her hand with an urgency that betrayed her fear. "Please, Miss Marple," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "find the truth. Henry doesn't belong in there. He doesn't deserve this." Agatha gave her a reassuring smile, a soft but unspoken promise. "I will do everything in my power, Mrs. Fletcher." As she stepped out into the cold, fog-choked air, Agatha paused for a moment, adjusting her scarf against the bite of the wind. The parlor's light spilled across the threshold, casting a fleeting shadow on the cobblestones. A small, thoughtful smile tugged at her lips as she considered the fragments she had gathered. Though they didn't yet fit together, Agatha felt the stirrings of something greater at work. There was a truth hidden in this small, modest home, and it would be the key to unraveling the threads of the mystery. The misty streets of East London, with their soot-streaked bricks and the thick fog that clung like a spectre, seemed to whisper secrets to those who knew how to listen. Agatha Marple, though unassuming in her dark woolen coat, was attuned to the subtle shifts in the city's murmur. Her sharp mind moved easily through the shadowy alleys of the East End, just as it did through the more polished drawing rooms of the West End. At the corner of a narrow lane, the back door of a pub creaked open, spilling warm light into the fog for a brief moment before it shut again. Agatha slipped inside, the familiar scent of stale tobacco and damp wool filling the air. The murmur of conversation was low, intimate, a stark contrast to the chaos of the outside world. She settled at a corner table, her tea steaming in a chipped saucer, and allowed herself to blend into the background, her senses attuned to every whisper and every shift in the room. "They say it was deliberate, you know," muttered a man at the next table, his voice barely rising above the low hum of the room. He leaned closer to his companion, whose overcoat was too fine for such a humble setting. "Tampered with, to point the blame elsewhere." Agatha's fingers tightened around her teacup, her gaze steady, and her face a mask of indifference, as she let the conversation wash over her. The second man, his voice smooth and deliberate, responded, "What sort of tampering?" His accent was faintly clipped, a sign of education perhaps. "Not that it matters. Those at the top always find a way to bury the truth, don't they?" "Sure," the first man replied, his voice dropping even lower, "but it was a proper nobleman involved. High up, you know them, the kind that doesn't take the stand themselves but have hands everywhere." He gestured vaguely, his fingers dancing through the haze of pipe smoke. "They say he's done it before, turned things to his advantage, always comes out smelling like roses." The second man chuckled, a sound more knowing than amused. "That's the trouble with men like him," he said. "Too much polish, not enough conscience, still a dangerous one to cross." Agatha's gaze drifted out the window, beyond the frost-laced panes, to the darkened alleyway. The faint gaslight at the corner cast weak pools of gold onto the wet cobblestones. Her mind churned, each word from the conversation settling into place. A nobleman, tampering with evidence, a story much larger than the one she had first believed. In the quiet corners of East London, the threads of the mystery were slowly tightening, and Agatha was certain that what she had just overheard was the key to unlocking the truth. The rumor seemed almost too implausible, too far-fetched for anyone to believe, yet in the dim glow of the smoky tea room, Agatha couldn't shake the unsettling sense that the truth might be even darker than the whispers hinted at. She allowed the seed of doubt to settle in her mind, burying itself deep like a hidden truth, waiting to take root. The words of the two men lingered, their gossip as thinly veiled as the smoke coming up from their pipes. If these whispers held any merit, they painted a picture far more intricate than simple malice or greed. The involvement of someone from the upper echelons of society, a person with the means to manipulate events, to cover their tracks with such subtlety, suggested a scheme layered in deception, stretching far beyond what was visible on the surface. Agatha folded her hands in front of her, the delicate gloves pressed together, as she thought carefully about her next move. Her tea sat forgotten, steam rising from the chipped saucer, the sounds of the room around her almost drowned out by the swirling thoughts in her mind. She could sense it, the deeper, more sinister motives at play, hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. Her instincts told her she had stumbled upon something monumental, something that could shift the very foundation of the case, if she played her cards right. She rose from the table, her coat swirling around her, as she stepped out into the fog-choked street, the chill of the night air biting at her skin. The dense fog seemed to welcome her, swallowing her whole as she moved through the narrow, twisting lanes of East London. Each step, though taken in the quietest of whispers, felt like a beat in a larger symphony, a symphony of secrets, betrayal, and intrigue that would eventually reveal itself to those brave enough to seek the truth. She didn't know yet how all the pieces would fit together, but something told her the game was far from over. As the days passed, the whispers continued, but Agatha's focus never wavered. She had learned to trust the subtle cues of the world around her, and they were beginning to form a clearer picture. It was a week after the trial had begun, and the shadow of doubt still clung to Arthur Beck like a second skin. He had taken refuge in a small charity shelter on the outskirts of the city, a modest sanctuary far removed from the chaos of London's bustling streets. The room was cold, its dim light flickering weakly as shadows danced across the cracked walls. The silence of the night was broken only by the occasional distant foghorn and the quiet murmur of traffic, but within those walls a different kind of noise echoed in Beck's mind. The nightmare had been vivid, far too vivid to ignore. He had seen the gilded corridors of Sir Edmund Carlyle's estate, a place he had never visited before, yet the details were unmistakable, the intricate moulding, the polished mahogany doors, and the portraits of long-dead ancestors staring down from their frames, as if they knew more than they ever let on. Blackwood's movements were deliberate, his posture commanding, and yet there was an unnerving stillness to him, like a predator stalking its prey. Beck's heart raced as the scene unfolded before him. He watched as Blackwood paused near a door, his fingers brushing against the gilded handle before disappearing into the shadows. The image was burned into Beck's mind, a chilling reminder of how out of place he had felt in that opulent world. He had seen Henry Fletcher there too, awkward, uncomfortable, like a man who didn't belong. But Blackwood wasn't out of place. He was a man who had shaped that world, who controlled it with an elegance that could deceive anyone. Beck clutched his blanket tightly, his fingers trembling as he muttered the name, as if saying it aloud might banish the nightmare. But it lingered swirling in his thoughts, bringing with it a new wave of doubt. This wasn't the simple case of a scapegoat being thrust into the limelight. This was something more carefully crafted, more insidious. Beck stared at the flickering candle, its weak light casting long shadows in the room. The face of Blackwood haunted him, the sharp angles of his features, the slight smirk that hinted at secrets known only to him. Beck's pulse quickened as the realization began to settle in. He had misjudged the situation. There were forces at play here far beyond his understanding. Blackwood's name had come up in hushed tones before, whispers in back alleys and smoke-filled rooms, always in reference to his quiet power. A man of refinement, yes, but behind the polished veneer, there was a man who could orchestrate events with the slightest of movements. Beck's thoughts raced as the truth slowly began to reveal itself, a truth far more complicated and far more dangerous than he had imagined. The townhouse of Lord Rurt Blackwood loomed before Agatha, a stark contrast to the dark labyrinthine streets she had walked earlier that day. Its facade was the epitome of wealth and power, a vision of Georgian perfection, the stonework gleaming under the faint glow of the street lamps. As the gaslight flickered against the polished brass door fixtures, a warmth seemed to radiate from the building, an artificial warmth, masking the cold reality of the man who resided within. She paused for a moment, her gloved hand resting lightly on the knocker, before she struck it once, the sound resonating through the quiet night. The door swung open to reveal Blackwood's valet, a figure of sharp precision, his stiff posture and impeccable attire betraying a lifetime of service. His gaze, however, flickered with a subtle unease as he ushered her into the grand hallway, its air thick with the scent of beeswax polish and the faint, lingering aroma of aged brandy. "Lord Blackwood is not receiving visitors at the valet stated, his voice a carefully modulated baritone. Agatha, undeterred, raised an eyebrow. "I'm here on a matter of great importance," she said, her tone cool but firm, "and I'm certain his lordship would not wish to delay it." The valet stiffened, his face an unreadable mask, though his fingers twitched at his side, betraying his discomfort. "What matter might that be, madame?" he inquired, his tone guarded. Agatha met his gaze, her own unyielding. "I believe Lord Blackwood holds knowledge that could clear an innocent man's name." The valet's expression remained unchanged, but the flicker of hesitation in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm afraid his lordship is rather preoccupied with engagements," he responded, his voice growing colder. "Perhaps, but I imagine Lord Blackwood's engagements are quite flexible," Agatha countered, watching his reaction closely. The valet's composure faltered for the briefest of moments before he recovered. "I assure you, madame, His lordship's matters are quite pressing." Agatha allowed a pause to stretch between them, her gaze flicking to the side table where a spare set of keys rested, glinting in the dim light. "A spare set of keys?" she asked casually, though her words carried a weight that seemed to settle into the air between them. "Doesn't it seem rather prudent for someone of his station to carry a spare, particularly if the original is ever misplaced?" The valet's fingers twitched again, this time more noticeably, but he responded with practiced indifference. "Those keys are for the staff entrance, madame. His lordship never uses them." Agatha's brow arched, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "How fortunate," she murmured, "that all keys lead to the same place." The valet's eyes flickered, a brief flash of panic crossing his face before he regained his usual stoicism. "I'm afraid I can be of no further help, madame," he said stiffly, his dismissal as swift as it was final. Agatha's smile remained, polite but laced with an unspoken challenge. "You've been most illuminating," she replied, her voice smooth as silk. As she was shown out, the grandeur of the hallway seemed to fade into a somber silence, the weight of her discoveries settling heavily upon her. The valet's words had been careful, but his unease had not gone unnoticed. An extra set of keys, a shift in his demeanor, a reflexive dismissal of certain questions, these were the threads Agatha would pull on, weaving them into the tapestry of a much larger truth. The polished veneer of Lord Blackwood's world could not conceal the cracks she had just begun to uncover. Stepping out into the crisp night air, Agatha felt the cold bite of the London fog. It was only the beginning, but already the pieces were falling into place. Later that evening, she found herself in an altogether different setting. The library of Lady Evelyn Carlisle was a room steeped in the quiet elegance of a bygone era. Tall bookshelves, lined with cracked leather volumes, reached toward the high ceiling, their spines faded with age. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, lavender furniture polish, and the lingering warmth of a low-burning fire. Lady Evelyn herself sat by the hearth, a figure of quiet grace but evident weariness. Once the pride of the Carlisle name, she now carried herself with a certain sadness, a disillusionment born of years of disappointment. Her gown, though finely tailored, was modestly cut, and the jewelry she wore was understated. As she spoke, her voice was smooth, almost melancholic, betraying little of the emotion behind her carefully chosen words. "I understand you have questions about my late cousin," she said, gesturing for Agatha to sit by the fire. Agatha took the seat, her mind already processing the subtle nuances in Lady Evelyn's demeanor. "I'm not sure what I can add, but I'll do my best to help," Lady Evelyn continued, her smile faint and distant. Agatha nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead, picking apart the clues hidden beneath the surface of this elegant facade. She knew the answers she sought were somewhere within this room, among the layers of history and regret. The night was young, and the game was far from over. Lady Evelyn's lips trembled ever so slightly as she handed over the bundle of papers, the faint tremor betraying the gravity of what she was about to reveal. Agatha's gaze remained steady, absorbing every movement, every subtle shift in the air between them. "These," Lady Evelyn whispered, her voice tight with emotion, "are the letters and ledgers Sir Edmund gathered before his death. He believed there were more than just whispers surrounding Lord Blackwood. These would have been enough to bring the truth to light." Agatha unwrapped the faded ribbon with delicate fingers, each twist of the paper unfolding yet another layer of the mystery that had been painstakingly hidden for so long. The documents, meticulously organized, revealed carefully coded language, their contents dancing on the edge of propriety, enough to ruin reputations and livelihoods alike. Agatha's breath caught as she read the name she had feared to find. Blackwood, his dealings though never spoken of in public, were all too evident here, woven into the fabric of high society's corruption. "Lord Blackwood," Agatha murmured softly, her mind racing with the implications. The same Lord Blackwood, who would stop at nothing to bury the past, to silence those who knew too much. Lady Evelyn looked away, her eyes drifting to the portrait of her late cousin that hung on the wall, her face shadowed with regret. "He was determined," she said quietly, her voice almost breaking. "He kept these papers despite my warnings. He was afraid of what would happen to him if those who stood to lose the most discovered his intentions." Agatha leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. "And you, were you not afraid?" Lady Evelyn's features hardened, the faintest flicker of anger beneath her calm exterior. "I was afraid for him, for his safety. I begged him to let it go, but he wouldn't. And now," her words trailed off, the weight of grief and guilt hanging heavily in the room. With a steady breath, she regained her composure, her voice growing resolute once again. "I can't undo what's been done, but if these papers can help someone else, then I won't stand in their way." Agatha rose, the bundle of documents now heavy in her hand, its significance not lost on her. "Your courage won't go unnoticed, Lady Evelyn," she said, her voice steady with resolve. The firelight danced in Lady Evelyn's eyes as she gave a faint melancholy smile. "Do what must be done, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "More than I could manage." Agatha stepped into the cool, silent hallway, her heart pounding as the weight of what she had learned settled in. Outside, the streets of London stretched before her, darkened by mist and shadow, as if the city itself were hiding secrets too dangerous to see the light. With the papers clutched tightly in her hand, Agatha allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The path forward had never been clearer, and yet it was fraught with peril. She moved through the slick cobblestones, her mind consumed by the labyrinth of connections she had just uncovered. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still damp, the gaslights casting wavering reflections on the glistening stones beneath her feet. The city's hum continued unabated, carriages passing, the muffled sounds of a distant pub, the occasional shout from a tradesman, but Agatha's thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the revelations that had begun to weave together in a tapestry of intrigue. Sir Edmund's death, Blackwood's elusive presence in the corridor, the valet's slip of the tongue, each piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Why had a man of Blackwood's stature been so near the scene of Sir Edmund's death, only to vanish without a trace? And why had the valet, normally so composed, displayed signs of nervousness, his eyes darting and his jaw tightening when pressed on certain details? These were not the actions of an innocent man, and Agatha knew it. The documents Lady Evelyn had entrusted her with were more than just paper and ink. They were a key to unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of London's elite. The more Agatha examined them, the clearer the danger became. Financial misconduct, coded messages, veiled threats, all pointed to a scandal too vast to ignore. But in the dim light of London's streets, one question lingered: would she be able to expose the truth before those who had everything to lose came for her first? The shadows of contradiction deepened with each step she took, and Agatha's mind worked furiously, the pieces aligning into a chilling mosaic. As she reached a narrow alley, the contrast between the dark, narrow space and the glittering opulence of Mayfair could not have been starker. Here on the edge of two worlds, Agatha knew that this was where the heart of the mystery lay, between the gilded mansions and the forgotten streets, where the truth could be buried, or perhaps finally uncovered. The game was on. The streets of London, soaked in the remnants of rain and shrouded in a thick veil of mist, held secrets far darker than what their cobblestones could ever reveal. Agatha's footsteps echoed softly in the eerie quiet, each step carrying with it the weight of knowledge and uncertainty. The city's grand stone-faced mansions, where the powerful hid behind their lavish facades, believed they could shield their misdeeds with wealth and influence. Yet the undercurrent of their actions always found a way to seep out, spilling over into the lives of the voiceless, those caught in the web of corruption without the means to clear their names. As Agatha walked through the fog, she felt the weight of those nameless lives pressing against her chest, driving her forward through the shadowy labyrinth of London's streets, determined to find the truth buried beneath the layers of deception. The heavy hand of Blackwood's involvement loomed large, casting a shadow across every piece of evidence she had gathered. But she knew better than to rely on shadows. They were fleeting, changing with the light, their form never constant. Agatha, in all her experience, understood that the truth was far less elusive. What she needed was certainty, and as the fog began to lift ever so slightly, she found herself on the edge of something undeniable. Each piece of the puzzle was fitting together, the distorted threads of suspicion now forming a clear and dangerous pattern. Blackwood's name was no longer just a whispered rumor. It was everywhere, entangled in each document, each carefully phrased letter, and in every evasive glance from the people who had once shielded him. The valet's slip, the coded messages, Lady Evelyn's trembling hands, they all pointed to the same dark conclusion. There was more to Blackwood's involvement than anyone had dared to imagine. The pieces were no longer scattered, they were falling into place. Agatha's pace quickened as she turned down a narrow alley, the sound of her footsteps muted against the slick cobblestones. The opulence of Mayfair seemed a world away now, its grand buildings a distant memory compared to the grimy, decaying alleyways that now surrounded her. This was where the true story lay, beneath the layers of gold and velvet, in the places where the forgotten lingered, unseen and unheard. In these unassuming streets, the power and privilege of the upper class collided with the harsh, unforgiving reality of the lower world. It was here, amidst the shadows and the silence, that Agatha felt the weight of her task most keenly, the task of giving a voice to those whose lives had been destroyed by the invisible hands of the powerful. The realization was clear now. Lord Blackwood was at the center of a vast tangled conspiracy, but even in the clarity of this understanding, the puzzle was far from complete. Agatha knew that each revelation, each shred of evidence, was just one part of a much larger game, a game where everyone had their secrets, their hidden motives, and where the truth could not be trusted unless it was fully exposed. She was not yet done, not by a long shot. Meanwhile, as the first light of dawn crept over the city, Arthur Beck sat alone on a weathered bench in the park, lost in the distant hum of the awakening city. The cold air stung his skin, the rain having left only a faint mist in its wake. Beck stared blankly at the path ahead, his hands clutching a chipped enamel cup of lukewarm tea, though he barely registered its taste. His mind, however, was a whirlwind of images and emotions, his thoughts consumed by a memory that had haunted him in the dark recesses of his mind for weeks. And now, in the stillness of the morning, it came crashing back, vivid and undeniable. He was no longer in the park, no longer a man lost in the fog of his own indecision. In his mind's eye, he was back in that shadowed hallway, surrounded by the heavy scent of beeswax and roses. The gilded walls flickered with the light of sconces, casting long shadows across the room. And there, standing before him with the poised grace of someone used to controlling every detail of their world, was Lord Rupert Blackwood. Beck's pulse quickened as he watched Blackwood's gloved hand slip a small piece of folded paper into Henry Fletcher's work-bag. The action was casual, almost rehearsed, but Beck saw it for what it truly was, a deliberate, calculated move. The letter was no mere correspondence, it was a key, one that would unlock the door to a conspiracy so deep, so dangerous, that Beck could scarcely comprehend it. The memory hit him like a blade to the chest, cold and sharp. The clarity of the moment, the stillness of Blackwood's expression, the subtle amusement on his lips as he slipped the paper into Fletcher's bag, was seared into Beck's mind, too vivid to be ignored. It wasn't just something he had imagined or dreamed, it was real, something he had witnessed with his own eyes. Yet in the confusion and chaos that had followed, the full weight of what he had seen had slipped from his grasp, buried beneath fear and uncertainty. Now, as he sat there, the truth slammed into him with the force of a tidal wave. Blackwood had not acted in haste. He had manipulated the situation with cold, calculating precision, and Beck, in his silence, had allowed it to happen. He had been complicit. With shaking hands, Beck gripped the cup tightly, his knuckles turning white as the rain continued to fall in soft, steady drizzles. The weight of his realization pressed down on him, heavier than the dampness in the air. The city around him seemed to blur as he rose from the bench, his legs unsteady beneath him. The truth was no longer a distant possibility, it was a fact, and Beck could no longer ignore it. The streets, still wet from the morning rain, blurred in his vision as he walked, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. The memory of Blackwood's cold, impassive face haunted him, as did the image of Henry Fletcher's confusion, the mounting accusations that had seemed so unbelievable at the time. But the truth was undeniable now. To speak would be to expose Blackwood for the manipulator he was. It would be to step into the light, to name the man who had orchestrated a conspiracy so intricate that it seemed impossible, but to remain silent would be to let that same conspiracy continue, to allow the innocent to suffer while the guilty walked free. In the silence of his cramped, stifling room, Beck stood at the window, looking out at the city stretching beneath him. The weight of the decision before him was suffocating. The choice was no longer whether to speak, it was whether he could live with himself if he didn't. The city continued its march forward, unaware of the burden now placed upon Beck's shoulders, but in that moment as the mist slowly cleared and the first rays of sunlight cut through the gloom, he understood that the price of silence was far greater than the price of truth. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing with absolute clarity: the time to act had come. The world of London was a maze of secrets, each alley and cobblestone harboring its own dark tale. The rain had stopped hours ago, but its remnants still lingered, clinging to the city's underbelly like an unwanted memory. Agatha's boots clicked softly against the damp pavement as she stood at the mouth of a narrow shadowed alley, her breath steady in the cool night air. Above her, the sky was a black expanse, broken only by the occasional flicker of distant stars that struggled to pierce the thick clouds. Only one street lamp, its light weak and flickering, cast a dull glow on the slick stones beneath her feet. The city's pulse, the distant clatter of carts, the faint laughter spilling from taverns, the shouts of cabmen, was muted here, swallowed by the tight confines of this forgotten street. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath for the truth that was about to unfold. The silence shattered with the sound of footsteps, slow at first, then louder, more deliberate as they approached. From the shadows emerged Lord Rupert Blackwood, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the wet stones. He paused just beyond the circle of dim light, his tall figure bent under an invisible weight. His usual composure, so precise and unyielding, was gone, replaced by something far less certain, a man on the edge of a precipice, teetering between the life he had built and the ruin he knew was coming. Agatha watched him with calm, unwavering eyes, her posture unyielding, as she stood in the cold, her arms folded neatly across her chest. She did not speak. The silence between them was not merely empty, it was a void, filled with the unspoken tension of a confrontation long overdue. When Blackwood finally stepped into the faint glow, Agatha noticed the tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cuffs, the tightness in his jaw, the barely perceptible tightening at the corners of his mouth. These were not the movements of a confident man, they were the gestures of someone barely holding on to control, to the facade of dignity they so desperately clung to. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, almost swallowed by the night's silence. "I didn't think you'd stoop to summoning me in such a place." Agatha's lips twitched in the faintest smile, the expression barely visible in the dim light. "The truth," she replied coolly, "often prefers dark corners, Lord Blackwood. It has an aversion to drawing rooms and pleasantries." Blackwood's mouth opened as if to retort, but he seemed to think better of it. He stepped closer, the weight of his presence pressing down on the space between them. His polished exterior, the mask he had so carefully crafted over the years, was cracking, just a little, but enough to show the cracks beneath. "I don't see what you hope to gain from this," he said, though his words lacked the conviction they once held. "I've told you everything you need to know." Agatha's gaze remained steady, unfaltering. "Have you?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge. "I rather think you've told me exactly what you wanted me to know. Now, let's try again. What really happened that night?" Blackwood hesitated. The silence between them thickened, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The dim light danced across his sharp features, revealing the faint creases of a man who had lived with a secret far too long. At last he exhaled, the sound shaky, as though the truth was a weight he could no longer bear to keep. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice trembling despite his best attempt to steady it. "You think it's all so simple, black and white. But it's not. It never is." Agatha said nothing, her unblinking gaze urging him to continue, to unravel the story he had kept buried for so long. Blackwood ran a hand through his hair, the gesture one of rare desperation, as if even his carefully cultivated composure could not withstand the pressure any longer. "I was desperate," he whispered, his words barely audible in the night air. "You don't know what Sir Edmund was threatening to do. He had the documents, the letters, the figures, all of it. He was going to ruin us, not just me. All of us." Agatha's voice was soft but insistent. "Us?" she repeated, her gaze never leaving him. Blackwood's eyes flicked to hers, then away, as if weighing the cost of revealing the full truth. The moment stretched taut as a wire, before he finally allowed his shoulders to slump, the weight of his guilt settling in. "Yes," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "All of us, the families who built everything you see around you." The words hung in the air thick and suffocating. It was the confession of a man who had traded his soul for the preservation of his world, a man who had watched his own empire crumble, piece by piece, until it was no longer worth saving. The revelation, so carefully guarded, now lay bare between them. Agatha, despite herself, felt a flicker of something, regret perhaps, or pity, but she quickly buried it beneath the weight of the truth she had been chasing. Blackwood, once so sure of his position, now stood before her, a man undone. His past, his choices, had led him here to this grim alleyway, and for the first time he realized that the cost of silence was far greater than the price of truth. And as Agatha stood there, her eyes unwavering, she knew that no matter how dark the path ahead, the truth would always find its way into the light. The night had fallen deeper, the rains returned swift and unforgiving, as though the heavens themselves sought to cleanse the city of its sins. Agatha stood motionless in the alley, her coat clinging to her like the weight of the moment. The faint glow of the street lamp now barely managed to pierce the darkness, casting long shadows that stretched into the void. The dampness in the air was thick, a heavy mist rising from the cobblestones, and the distant sounds of London, its familiar hum of life, seemed to fade away into something far darker. In this space there was only the truth, and in its presence, everything else seemed irrelevant. Lord Blackwood stood before her, his once pristine appearance now soaked through with rain, his impeccable attire dripping with the weight of his own confessions. His voice, once steady and commanding, had shattered, now trembling as the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbled before her. "The foundations," he muttered bitterly, his words spilling out with a rawness that Agatha had not expected. That's what he called it, the foundations. But they were never solid, not really, just one crack, and everything falls apart. Edmund knew that, and he was going to tear it all down. I couldn't let him do it. I couldn't, I had no choice. He paused, his face a portrait of guilt and regret, as if the weight of his actions had finally begun to suffocate him. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, as though speaking the truth had become a struggle too heavy to bear. "If those papers had come to light," he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper, "it would have been ruinous, not just for me, for everyone who mattered." His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, full of a desperation that bordered on madness. "So I did what I had to do." Agatha's expression never faltered. She remained as composed as ever, her gaze unwavering as she assessed the man before her, knowing that the storm of his confession had only just begun. "And what precisely did you do, Lord Blackwood?" Her voice, though calm, held an edge, a quiet demand for the full truth. Blackwood flinched, the tremor in his hands betraying him. "I planted the letter," he said, each word a reluctant admission, as if he were confessing to a crime far greater than the world knew. "The one that led them to Fletcher. It wasn't enough to stop Edmund, but it was enough to buy time. I thought if I could make it look like someone else did it, it would give us a chance to figure out what to do, to control it." His words trailed off into silence, the weight of his failure pressing down upon him. Agatha waited, her silence as heavy as any accusation. She had seen this before, the desperation, the attempts to cover up one lie with another, but there was something raw in Blackwood's admission that gave her pause. He was unraveling, but still, he clung to the hope that redemption was within reach. "I thought it would be simple," he murmured, almost to himself, as the rain began to fall harder, its rhythm in sync with the turmoil that churned inside him. A forged letter, a convenient scapegoat. Fletcher. It wouldn't have come to this, if only Edmund had seen reason. But Edmund's gone now, and Fletcher became necessary. Blackwood shook his head, his words heavy with regret, but his confession was far from complete. Agatha stepped closer, her voice unwavering, cutting through the storm of his self-pity. "Necessary for what, Lord Blackwood?" she asked, her eyes never leaving his. He met her gaze then, fully, and for the first time his aristocratic composure, so carefully constructed over the years, was gone. His shoulders slumped, his facade of power shattered by the truth he could no longer hide. "Fletcher took the fall," he said, his voice thick with the weight of the lie that had once seemed so justifiable. "He was the perfect scapegoat, the trail would end with him, and everything would be contained, but that's not how it happened, is it?" His voice cracked, and in that moment, Agatha saw the man behind the mask, the man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind carefully cultivated lies. "I've worn so many masks," Blackwood confessed, his voice barely a whisper now. "I don't even remember what I look like without them. The lord, the trustee, the respectable gentleman, I was all those things, but none of them were real." The rain fell harder now, soaking into the fabric of his coat, his fine clothing, losing its sheen under the weight of his guilt. The street lamp flickered above them, casting an eerie light that made the alley feel even more suffocating, more claustrophobic. Blackwood stood there, a broken man, as the weight of his own sins bore down upon him. "I thought I could control it," he continued, his voice trembling with the admission. "I thought if I moved quickly, decisively, I could keep it all safe, keep it from falling apart. But it was like trying to stop water from leaking through a cracked wall. I patched one hole, and another appeared, and then another, and before long, it was too late." His voice trailed off, lost to the sound of the rain, but the weight of his words lingered between them. Agatha regarded him with the same steady gaze she had worn throughout this entire exchange. She said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch on, to fill the space with the gravity of his confession. Blackwood, exhausted and drenched, looked up at her once more. "I'm tired of hiding," he murmured, his voice raw but resolute. "I don't know if you'll believe me, but I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Agatha tilted her head, her sharp eyes searching his, as if weighing the sincerity of his words against the depth of his betrayal. "Make it right," she echoed softly, her tone a quiet challenge. "And how, Lord Blackwood, do you propose to do that?" For a moment he hesitated, the uncertainty flickering in his eyes, but then the resolve returned, clearer now. "I'll give everything up," he said, his voice steadier than before. "The documents, the accounts, the names of everyone involved. I won't protect them anymore. I'll testify, if I have to. And Fletcher," his voice faltered, but he pressed on, "I'll clear his name. He doesn't deserve to carry the weight of my sins. None of them do." The rain was relentless now, soaking them both, but the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Blackwood stood there, a man stripped of his masks, awaiting judgment. Agatha studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering, as the rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of a world built on lies. The courtroom was a silent battlefield, its air thick with anticipation, and as the heavy doors swung open, the tension within the walls of the Old Bailey seemed to crystallize. The stained glass windows bathed the room in fragmented hues, casting an almost eerie glow across the polished wood and cold stone, as if the very light itself had a secret to hide. Agatha sat quietly at the edge of the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene but calculating, her eyes tracing the smallest movements within the courtroom like a hawk watching its prey. The low hum of whispered conversations buzzed around her, but she remained unmoved, as if the swirling currents of unease could not touch her. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that today's proceedings would be nothing short of monumental. It would either exonerate an innocent man, or irrevocably damn him. A subtle smile tugged at the corners of her lips, not one of approval, but of something more guarded, hope perhaps, but a hope tempered by caution. Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet exchange behind her, a reporter murmuring to his colleague about Arthur Beck, the man who was set to take the stand once more. "He remembers it all now," the reporter said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Convenient, don't you think?" His colleague scoffed, scribbling notes with a palpable eagerness, his skepticism quickly replaced by professional curiosity. Agatha's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. She had seen enough to understand that Beck's testimony was no mere coincidence. It was the key that would unlock everything. She had always believed that truth, no matter how buried beneath layers of deceit, had a way of clawing its way to the surface. And today, in the grandeur of the Old Bailey, amidst the flickering light and the stifling air, the truth was about to reveal itself in all its raw and unrelenting clarity. As Beck took the stand, there was a distinct shift in the room, a collective intake of breath, as though the entire court held its breath in anticipation. Gone was the nervous, hesitant man who had faltered under questioning. In his place stood someone with a quiet resolve, a man who had wrestled with his conscience in the shadows, and now stood in the light, ready to speak his truth. His voice, though not loud, cut through the room like a blade, steady and unyielding. "I saw Lord Blackwood that night," Beck began, his eyes unwavering, as he addressed the courtroom. "He was in the corridor near Sir Edmund's study. It was late, and most of the household had retired for the night. But he moved quickly, with purpose. He wasn't supposed to be there." The prosecutor's eyes flickered, but Beck pressed on, his words deliberate and measured. "He had something in his hand, an envelope. He slid it into Henry Fletcher's belongings. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but when the documents were found on Fletcher," he paused, the weight of his next words hanging in the air. "That letter was no accident. I saw it happen." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a wave of realization sweeping across the room. The prosecutor's hand clenched around his notes, but Beck's testimony was unshakable, his calm certainty unraveling the very case they had built against Fletcher. "I didn't speak up before," Beck continued, his voice steady, his gaze never faltering. "I wasn't sure, I couldn't trust my own mind, but now I know what I saw. It was Lord Blackwood who planted that letter. He framed Henry Fletcher." The impact of his words was immediate. The barristers exchanged uneasy glances, their polished confidence cracking like fragile glass. There was no dramatic outburst, no theatrical revelation, just a simple undeniable truth, calmly spoken, that left no room for doubt. Beck's steady resolve was far more damning than any dramatic confession could ever be. From her seat, Agatha observed the unraveling of the case, the intricate web of lies spun by Blackwood slowly being exposed. The documents, the false leads, the manufactured guilt of Fletcher, all of it was coming apart at the seams. She could see the prosecutor's grip tightening on his papers, the judge's furrowed brow, as he made notes in the margins, and the shift in the room's energy as the truth made its presence known. It was as though the very air had changed, growing heavier, as if the walls of the courtroom themselves were bearing witness to a revelation long overdue. Agatha felt the puzzle pieces she had so carefully arranged in her mind snap into place with a satisfying clarity. The picture was clear now, for everyone to see, and there was no turning back. The courtroom remained thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of impending revelation. As Beck descended from the witness stand, his words lingered, suspended in the charged atmosphere, the aftermath of his testimony reverberating through the room, like the tremors of an earthquake. Agatha, ever the composed observer, allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, a flicker of triumph crossing her features. Justice, she mused, was often a slow, deliberate beast, but once it set its course, there was no stopping it. The courtroom, already taut with anticipation, seemed to grow even heavier as Agatha stood, her movements deliberate and precise. In her hands, she held a small dossier, bound in unassuming brown leather, a modest exterior masking the explosive contents within. As she laid the folder on the table with care, a collective breath seemed to be drawn by everyone present, the room leaning forward in silent anticipation. The prosecutor adjusted his glasses, his previously calm demeanor slipping slightly, while the judge paused in his note-taking, his attention now wholly focused. Even the reporter, pen hovering above his notepad, seemed to forget the rhythm of his scribbling. Agatha, having so often been dismissed as a mere quiet observer, now spoke with a clarity that sliced through the murmur of uncertainty. "Contained within this dossier," she began, her voice steady and calm, "are documents that illuminate the circumstances surrounding Sir Edmund's death. They have been gathered through weeks of meticulous inquiry, and I trust the court will find them enlightening." As she stepped aside, the evidence was passed up for review, the room descending into a hushed silence as the judge's eyes scanned the papers before him. His detached curiosity slowly gave way to sharper interest, his gaze narrowing with each page he turned. It was a moment of realization, the beginning of the unraveling. The defense counsel, sensing the tide turning, rose next. Holding up a letter for the court to see, he addressed the room with measured authority. "This letter," he said, "is one of many exchanged between Lord Blackwood and his business associates. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than a routine financial communication, but when cross-referenced with accompanying bank records, a different story emerges. These transactions were not routine at all. They were part of a deliberate effort to conceal the diversion of funds from a charitable trust funds originally meant for Sir Edmund's pet project." A low murmur spread through the gallery, rising in volume as the significance of the revelation began to sink in. Agatha, though, remained still, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression calm and expectant. She had always known that the truth, once exposed, would spread quickly, like water seeking out the smallest cracks in a dam. But it wasn't just the letters or the financial records that were turning the tide, it was the next revelation that would shatter the illusion of innocence. The court called Lady Evelyn Carryle to the stand. Her entrance was unhurried, her face unreadable, and the somber elegance of her attire conveyed a sense of quiet mourning. As she took her seat, the room quieted once more, the air thickening with anticipation. When she spoke, her voice was both steady and resolute, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "I did not want to believe what I saw," Lady Evelyn began, her gaze unwavering. "But the truth is undeniable. Sir Edmund, my cousin, uncovered serious misconduct. Lord Blackwood, among others, feared exposure. I remember the conversations, the pressure placed upon him to destroy the evidence. He refused." Her voice trembled briefly, but she steadied herself, her next words ringing out clear and forceful. "Shortly before his death, Sir Edmund confided in me. He told me he was ready to present his findings, letters, financial statements, names. That night, I saw Lord Blackwood at the house. He was not there as a guest, nor was he invited. He was there to silence Sir Edmund once and for all." Her words, spoken with the weight of undeniable truth, struck the courtroom like a hammer, each syllable echoing in the stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and for a moment, it seemed as though the very air had been sucked from the room. The prosecutor rose to object, but Lady Evelyn calmly held up her hand, her gaze unyielding. "The documents provided by Miss Marple," she continued, "match exactly what Sir Edmund described to me. They prove that Lord Blackwood orchestrated this entire affair, framing an innocent man to protect his own position." The shock in the room was palpable, the gallery buzzing with outrage, while the judge's gavel cracked through the rising chaos, demanding order. Yet, despite his command, the murmurs continued, growing louder, more frantic, as the truth began to take root. Agatha, from her seat in the gallery, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The carefully crafted facade of innocence, built over years of manipulation and deceit, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The lies, the red herrings, the distractions, all of them were falling away, leaving behind only the stark, undeniable truth. Lord Blackwood, who had once exuded power and privilege, now sat rigid in his seat, pale and broken. His gaze was fixed firmly on the desk in front of him, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to meet Agatha's eyes. She knew without a doubt that he could not bear to look at her. As the courtroom slowly regained some semblance of order, it became clear to all present that the true culprit was not the downtrodden railway worker, Henry Fletcher, but the man of high society, the man who had relied on his wealth and status to shield him from scrutiny. But no more. The truth had emerged, and with it, the certainty that there would be no escape. The weight of Agatha's gaze never wavered as the courtroom seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Lord Blackwood, his once imposing presence now diminished by the weight of his own guilt, rose to his feet with the reluctant slowness of a man carrying the unbearable burden of his own reckoning. The room fell into an unnatural silence, the soft shuffle of paper and the rustling of clothing halting as all eyes fixed on him. For weeks the trial had been a maelstrom of accusations, counterclaims, and carefully crafted denials. But now, in this final moment, it was as if the storm had broken, leaving behind the calm before the inevitable conclusion. Blackwood's expression, taut and strained, betrayed the inner conflict he had fought to suppress for so long. The mask he had worn so carefully was slipping away, revealing the raw truth of his actions. His voice when it emerged was hoarse, a low tremor betraying the fight he had waged within himself. It is never easy to admit when one has strayed so far from the path of integrity, he began, the words feeling heavy in the air, each syllable carrying the weight of years of deceit. But it is time long overdue that I speak plainly. A deep breath followed, a futile attempt at steadying the storm within him. I have betrayed not only my own honor, but the very principles I once held dear. I have manipulated evidence, planted lies, and sought to cast suspicion on an innocent man, Henry Fletcher, when it was I who feared the scrutiny of truth. A collective gasp swept the gallery, a ripple of disbelief and shock that reverberated throughout the room. For a moment the silence hung thick, the enormity of the admission settling like a heavy fog. Agatha watched intently from the edge of the gallery, her expression calm, her eyes sharp, observing every shift and flicker in Blackwood's demeanor. She had always known this moment would come. Few men could bear the weight of such a carefully constructed web of lies forever. Blackwood's voice faltered before regaining its strength. Sir Edmund Carril was a man of great principle, yes, but also one who possessed knowledge that could destroy lives, mine included. My actions, I admit, were not born out of malice, but out of fear. His gaze swept the room, not landing on a single person but taking in the weight of the crowd as a whole. And yet, fear, as I now understand, is no justification for what I have done. I confess fully to my crimes. His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, as the gallery's shock began to shift into an uncomfortable silence. I ask no forgiveness, Blackwood continued, his voice breaking slightly, only that justice be done. The stillness that followed was heavier than the sharpest gavel strike. All eyes turned to Henry Fletcher, hunched at the defense table, his face pale, his hands trembling ever so slightly. A man of modest means, thrust into a world of lies and power struggles far beyond his understanding. He had borne the weight of this trial with quiet dignity, never once flinching, but now, as Blackwood's confession reverberated throughout the room, the chains of suspicion seemed to loosen around him. The judge's voice cut through the silence, calm but firm. In light of Lord Blackwood's confession, and the corroborating evidence, it is clear that Mr. Fletcher is innocent of the charges brought against him. I hereby order his immediate release. The room exhaled as one a collective sigh of disbelief and relief. Fletcher blinked rapidly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him as tears welled in his eyes. He had long since resigned himself to a fate that was not his own, and now in the span of a single admission everything had shifted. His lawyer placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, and Fletcher nodded, a simple gesture of gratitude mixed with the realization that this nightmare had finally come to an end. In the gallery, Agatha watched the scene unfold with her usual composure, though her sharp gaze softened for just a moment. Justice, she had always believed, was more than just a verdict. It was the restoration of balance, a righting of wrongs, and as Henry Fletcher stood to be escorted out, not as a criminal but as a man exonerated, Agatha allowed herself the quietest of smiles. The web of lies had unraveled, the innocent man had been vindicated, the true culprit had faced his reckoning. As the courtroom began to buzz with whispers of triumph and sorrow, Blackwood, for all his confession, remained a tragic figure, a man who had desperately clung to a crumbling facade of power and privilege. Fletcher, though free, would carry the scars of his ordeal for the rest of his life. As the gallery began to disperse, Agatha lingered a moment longer, her gaze following Blackwood as he was led away, his head bowed and his shoulders stooped in defeat. She did not see a fallen nobleman, she saw a man on the cusp of a difficult journey toward redemption. When the heavy doors of the courtroom finally swung shut, the rain had ceased outside, and the city's bustling resumed, but inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained bittersweet, complex, and undeniably human. Justice, in all its imperfect glory, had been served. The embankment stretched before Henry Fletcher, quiet and desolate, the calm broken only by the soft hum of a city slowly stirring into life. The pale light of dawn shimmered on the surface of the river, transforming the water into liquid gold that flowed unhurriedly, as if it too was savoring the moment of renewal. Henry's every step was deliberate, measured, each footfall as though he were testing the ground beneath him after years of unsteady footing. His broad shoulders, once hunched beneath the crushing weight of suspicion, now stood square and firm, an outward reflection of the internal strength he had gained through his ordeal. The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he gazed out at the river, the steady flow mirroring the quiet peace now settling into his life. Behind him, familiar voices called out, their warmth reaching him long before their owners did. His wife, her arm entwined with their son's, hurried to catch up, her eyes bright with relief and pride not only for the man he had become but for the journey they had endured together. "Henry," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, the single word carrying a depth of meaning, of years of waiting, of the fear and hope that had intertwined throughout their lives. Their son, eager to feel the reality of his father's presence, reached out, his small hand gripping Henry's, as if to reassure himself that this moment was no illusion, that his father was indeed free. Together, they walked down the embankment, their soft laughter filling the morning air, an echo of the joy that had long been denied them. Passers-by nodded with polite recognition, a few offering hesitant smiles, as if the very atmosphere had shifted. The heavy weight of accusation that once surrounded Henry had lifted, and in its place was an aura of dignity that now seemed to emanate from him. It was as though the very air had changed, no longer charged with the bitterness of suspicion, but rather filled with the quiet honor of a man who had reclaimed his life. As they walked through the city, their path no longer shrouded by the whispers of doubt, the morning felt different, brighter, lighter, and full of possibilities that had once seemed far beyond reach. Across the city, the first rays of sunlight crept into Agatha Marple's modest office, casting long shadows across the walls. The familiar scent of tea brewing mingled with the sharp tang of ink and the musty, comforting smell of old paper. Agatha sat at her desk, her small hands curled around a steaming cup, her eyes gazing absently out of the window. Below, the city studded to life, a baker unlocking his shop door, a delivery boy pedaling past with a basket of goods, the distant rumble of a milk cart as it made its way down the cobblestone streets. To most, it was an ordinary morning, but for Agatha, it was a rare moment of stillness. In the silence, her thoughts swirled, each one touching on the case that had consumed so much of her attention. She replayed the key moments, the unraveling of Blackwood's web of lies, the way the falsehoods had been expertly spun and woven until they had seemed real, until they had threatened to destroy an innocent man. She thought of the clues, small seemingly inconsequential details that had over time pieced together into a damning portrait. It had taken patience, persistence, and above all, an unwavering belief in the truth, to see through the layers of deception. The truth had always been obscured by human frailty, by greed, by fear, but in the end, it had emerged. As it always did, the truth had a way of finding its light, even in the darkest of places. Agatha took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her, and allowed herself a fleeting moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served, yes, but not in the way many might have hoped. There had been no grand sweeping triumph, no final victorious gesture, but there had been courage, the courage of a man like Fletcher, who had borne the weight of injustice with quiet strength, the courage of Evelyn, who had come forward when it would have been far easier to remain silent, and the courage of Blackwood, who in the end had faced the full consequences of his actions. Each of them, in their own way, had demonstrated the kind of courage that, though it could never undo the harm already done, at least paved the way for healing. Agatha set her cup down, her eyes drifting over the neat pile of notes on her desk. The hum of the city below grew louder, signaling the start of another day. She rose slowly from her seat, preparing for the work that lay ahead, the familiar rhythm of her life resuming. Her work, her calling, had always been about more than solving crimes. It was about understanding the complexities of human nature, about the delicate balance between right and wrong, and about the choices that led people down paths they never thought they would walk. As she made her way toward the door, her thoughts lingered on the case, on the people involved, and on the way it had revealed the nuances of morality, the shades of gray that often lay beneath the surface of every decision. Truth, Agatha reflected, was never as clear-cut as many would like to believe. It was fragile, built piece by piece, like a puzzle that could only be completed with time, patience, and empathy. But in the end, the pieces always came together, and in that quiet realization, Agatha found peace, a small but lasting sense of contentment in knowing that for once, the scales of justice had tilted toward the truth. In the dim light of the prison cell, the scratch of a pen echoed softly. Lord Blackwood sat hunched over a simple wooden desk, the single candle before him flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the stone walls. The weight of his past sins seemed to hang in the air, suffocating the small space with a presence far heavier than any physical chains. The man who had once wielded power and influence with ruthless certainty, now sat broken, his every move slow and deliberate, as though the act of writing these final words was all that remained between him and the abyss. His pen scratched against the paper, each word a small act of penance, a way to make sense of the wreckage his life had become. Redemption, he knew, would not come easily, not after everything he had done, and yet, there was a flicker of something deep within him, an ember of hope that perhaps, even in this prison of stone and regret, there might still be a way forward. Perhaps this confession, these final words, would be the first step toward that redemption, and perhaps, in time, the shattered pieces of his life could be mended. though he knew it would take far more than a few lines of ink to heal the wounds he had inflicted. The air was thick with dampness, the stone walls cold and unforgiving, as the first light of dawn barely touched the prison yard. Gone were the fine suits, the polished shoes, the confident steps of a man who once moved through London's elite circles with effortless ease. The man sitting now at the old creaking desk was but a shadow of his former self. Lord Blackwood, once an influential figure, now wore the coarse, worn uniform of the condemned. His shoulders, once proud and unbowed, now slumped under the weight of his reflections, his eyes hollow with regret. The ink in his pen moved with steady determination, each word a final attempt to make sense of the wreckage his life had become. The letter he wrote did not begin with a plea for mercy, for forgiveness. It began instead with a stark acknowledgement of his downfall, his pen scratching the surface of his remorse, as if the very action itself was a penance. "I have no illusions," he wrote, his hand steady, but his mind clouded with the weight of the past. "I betrayed the trust placed in me, and now I must bear the consequences. But as I reflect on my life, on its moments of pride, of failure, of cowardice, I find one singular truth: it is never too late to choose the difficult path, the right path, even if one walks it only briefly." He paused then, the pen hovering just above the page, as if the words he was about to write could never truly express the depth of his guilt. Yet, he pressed on, "What I have done cannot be undone. My actions caused irreparable harm to those who deserved better, and my name shall forever carry the weight of shame. But perhaps there is a chance for some small redemption. I intend to devote the days I have left, however few they may be, to unearthing the wrongs I ignored, to speaking the truths I once buried. My hope is that by doing so, I might prove to myself that the man I became is not all that I am." As the night wore on, the letter grew longer, each word like a fragment of the soul Blackwood was trying desperately to reclaim. The candle flickered weakly beside him, casting long shadows across his face, now gaunt and lined with age. By the time the final words were written, Blackwood sat back, exhausted yet somehow at peace. He folded the letter neatly and stamped it with the wax seal of his family crest, a last act of finality. The letter would find its way to those he had wronged. Perhaps one day, when the wounds were no longer so raw, they would read it and see not just a villain, but a man who had tried, perhaps too late, but earnestly, to atone for his sins. As the morning broke over the city, Agatha Marple stepped onto the street, her coat pulled tightly around her against the sharp, brisk air. The city, as it always did, stretched out before her, indifferent to the lives unfolding within its walls. The sounds of London waking up, the muffled clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the soft rustle of newspapers being folded, the faint whistle of a baker's boy, making his morning rounds, created a symphony of ordinary moments, a stark contrast to the weight of the events she had just witnessed. Henry Fletcher's honor had been restored, his name cleared of the stains that had once threatened to ruin him. Blackwood's name, though forever tarnished, had gained a strange kind of dignity in his admission of guilt. And for Agatha, though the case had been settled, there lingered a faint satisfaction, not the kind born of triumph, but of quiet resolution. Justice, she had long known, was rarely neat and easily packaged. It was often jagged, painful, and imperfect, but it had a way of settling into the cracks of reality, where it became something real, something enduring. As she walked through the city, her thoughts drifted back to the case, to the twists and turns that had led to this point. The truth, she reflected, had a curious way of revealing itself. It didn't appear in sudden bursts of light, but instead unfolded in layers, one after another, showing not just the facts but the complexities, the emotions, the human flaws that lay beneath them. She passed a newsstand, where the morning papers heralded the resolution of the trial, but beyond that headline, she knew there were more stories waiting. Some unfolding now, others hidden in the shadows, yet to be discovered. Agatha's work, she knew, was never truly done. There was always another mystery, another story to uncover, another truth to expose. And despite the exhaustion that sometimes weighed on her, there was a comfort in that. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, always found its way to the surface. As Agatha turned a corner and made her way toward her office, the wind tugged at her coat, and she clutched it tighter around her. A faint smile touched her lips. Each case she took on, each new mystery, left a mark on her understanding of the world, on her sense of purpose. And as the city hummed around her, she knew that she would continue, following the faint trails of evidence, the whispered hints of deceit, until every last truth had been uncovered. The fog that had blanketed London for days finally began to recede, unveiling a city that seemed to breathe a little easier, stirring cautiously toward a brighter horizon. The trial, its revelations, its drama, had left its mark not only on the front pages but in the hearts and minds of those who had watched it unfold. It was a tale that would be whispered for years to come, a story passed between generations, reminding all who heard it that even the most labyrinthine web of lies could be unraveled with patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. Henry Fletcher, a man once burdened by the crushing weight of false accusations, had become something far greater than a mere survivor. He had become a symbol of resilience, his quiet strength now regarded as something to be admired. Though he remained the same humble, unassuming figure, his name was spoken with reverence, his reputation fully restored. In the bustling streets of London, children sang rhymes about Fletcher, the freedman, and in the working-class pubs of Soho and Borough, they spoke of him with the kind of respect that only those who had weathered their own storms could truly understand. As for Lord Blackwood, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a much darker chapter in his life. Stripped of his influence, his once revered name reduced to whispered scandals in the corridors of power, he now faced the full consequence of his actions. The very men who had once eagerly shaken his hand now crossed the street to avoid his gaze, the weight of his betrayal too heavy for even their polite facades to conceal. Yet in the silence of his fall from grace, there were murmurs that he had begun a quiet and perhaps futile attempt at redemption. Anonymous donations flowed to those he had wronged, whispers of apologies were passed through intermediaries, and though it could never undo the damage, some believed that Blackwood sought to at least make amends in the most private and inconspicuous of ways. Redemption, if it ever came, would be a long and solitary road. As for Agatha Marple, she walked through the city with the same quiet determination, her presence as unnoticed as the very streets she inhabited. She made no speeches, accepted no accolades, for those who had come to know her efforts understood that she sought no recognition. Her satisfaction lay not in the applause of others, but in the quiet, unyielding act of righting wrongs, in the patient process of uncovering truths that others had long buried. She moved through the city as if a part of it, her sharp eyes ever observant, her mind constantly sifting through the complexities of human nature. To some she was a shadow, slipping through the crowds unnoticed, but to others she was a quiet guardian, a woman whose commitment to justice, though often unseen, had proven that truth, no matter how long buried, could and would always rise to the surface. One morning, as she crossed London Bridge, the last tendrils of mist finally cleared, and the sun broke through, scattering golden light over the Thames. The water sparkled with a clarity that seemed to mirror the mood of the city, a city reborn. There was a faint smile on Agatha's lips, as she looked out over the river, though no one was near to see it. London was no longer heavy with doubt, no longer suffocated by the shadows of past injustices. The people of the city, once hesitant and worn, now found themselves daring to believe again in the power of truth. And Agatha Marple, as always, knew that while this chapter had ended, the stories of the city, its mysteries, its hidden truths, would continue to unfold. But for now, she could walk these streets knowing that for once the city was lighter, its heart beating with the quiet, powerful rhythm of justice.